This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the X-Cast, X-Files Podwatch, episode 41, covering Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man and Tunguska. I'm your host, Zach Moore, and with me is author of Opening the X-Files, a critical history of the original series, Mr. Darren Mooney. What's up, Darren?
Nothing much. I'm actually just wondering if we have to talk about Tunguska at all.
You know, I'm glad we seem to be on the same page on that. We'll save a good 25% episode for that, 25% of this episode for that, but let's talk about what we're really here to talk about, guys. Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man. Written by Glenn Morgan, directed by James Wan, aired on November 17th, 1996. This episode is amazing. You know, we talked about EBE way back, right, Darren? And how that was making Deep Throat into a three-dimensional character because he had just been a plot device up to that point. Cigarette-Smoking Man, he was a character up to this point, don't get us wrong, but this is the first time we kind of really get to know him as a three-dimensional person. Or do we? Again, there's ambiguity in this episode, much like, classic Chris Carter storytelling technique. Hey, this is all rumor, so it might not be accurate, but here's a cool story about it. Because it does, as cool as the story is, it does contradict some things that maybe were established earlier in the show, but it's just such a fun ride, and they have the caveat of the lone gunmen have found out this information, so there might be gaps in the authenticity of the story. But yeah, the life and times of the Cigarette-Smoking Man, an excellent idea for an episode, and well executed, and just one of my overall favorites.
Yeah, definitely be one of my top 10. It is actually interesting that you should sort of mention like that ambiguity, because I think that one of the central tensions of the episode, and I think around the production of the episode as well, because this is one of those episodes that feels very, and we talked about the X-Files being postmodern with EBE, but being very self-aware and stuff, because it is there are several points in the episode where it feels almost like Morgan and Wong are sort of in conflict with Carter about what they want to do. There's a famous story about how when Bill Davis received the original title of this episode, it was called Memoirs rather than Musings, in that the implication was, according to Glenn Morgan, he believes that everything portrayed in this episode really happened within the world of the X-Files, whereas Carter and the other writers have tended to downplay it. There's the fact that in the final version of the episode, there's the ending is changed in the Cigarette-Smoking Man's novel, and then there was famous trouble behind the scenes where Carter and the other writers changed the ending that Glenn Morgan wanted to have for the episode, which he alludes to repeatedly, just in case you don't get that. But I mean, there's this wonderful sort of meta-textual, sort of metaphysical element to it, where you pointed out that because it comes from the lone gunman, it's not trustworthy. But at the end, Fro Hickey explains that he coupled this version of the Cigarette-Smoking Man's history together from what he believes to be novels that were written by the Cigarette-Smoking Man and serialized in Roman de Claf. There's a sense that even if this is true within the world of the X-Files, it exists one level away from truth. It's a fictionalized history of a fictionalized history, which is just incredibly clever and incredibly wry. And this is a top 10 episode for me. And being honest, even outside of the X-Files, this is an episode of television that I just love. I think as a piece of drama, as a 45-minute story in and of itself, it is just a beautiful piece of work.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about, as we're doing this retrospective podcast on the X-Files, at the time when the show was on the air, when stuff tied into mythology with aliens and two-parters and cliffhangers and premieres and finales, that's what everybody gravitated towards. But now looking back, it's these self-contained episodes that really stick out ahead of the pack, because it's a fulfilling experience to watch it start to finish, right? There's an arc, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and these are the ones that stand the test of time, especially because they are self-contained, because when this greater mythology episodes, these arcs, they keep building and building and building and building, and then ultimately they might be a little disappointing, but you can take these nuggets out of Musings of Cigarette-Smoking Man. This episode, as you said, just a great episode of television, period, even if it wasn't an X-Files show.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about how disappointing the mythology could be in about 10 minutes, I suspect. But I really, really like about it is that, again, we talked about this when we were talking about like stuff like Young at Heart and stuff like that, about how even the standalones, like, though you draw a line between the standalone and the mythology episodes, the standalones tell you a lot about what the X-Files is. And like, Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man is like a perfect episode for espousing how the X-Files looks at the world. And like, it might not be a mythology episode, but it's the perfect episode about the mythology, which is, I think, true also of, say, Darren Morgan's like Jose Chung's From Outer Space, which is, I would argue, a spiritual companion to this. Like, there's a sense that throughout Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man, and it comes up repeatedly through this idea of extraordinary men. Like, it's brought up when the cigarette smoking man is brought into the interview about assassinating Kennedy. It's like, you know, there are few people who control their own lives, but there are those who exert influence over the lives of others, and those are extraordinary men. Or when he's talking about Martin Luther King and his ability to change the course of history, and how he describes him as an extraordinary man. And even how Frohickey at the end of the episode talks about the true tragedy of the cigarette smoking man being that he exerts so much influence on the lives of other people, yet has no control over his own destiny. Like, I think this taps into what the mythology and the conspiracy of the X-Files sort of like really, why it appeals to people in the way that it does, like why conspiracy theory is so gripping to us, and particularly why it's become like more common in this era of like you know, information technology, of like of the internet, of all this sort of stuff. Like, it's the belief, we want to believe that the world is governed by choice and by will, and that everything happens according to a plan. That, like, Kennedy couldn't possibly have been shot by a lunatic sitting in a book depository who was angry about Cuba. He had to have been victim of this vast global international conspiracy. Or that Martin Luther King couldn't have been shot by a simple racist. No, it had to be part of like a larger story. Like, the thing that I really like about Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man is it understands the worldview of the X-Files. Like, it understands the appeal of, like, conspiracy theory to Mulder, a way of making sense of a senseless and chaotic world. Like, it's more interesting to believe the world is run by terrible people than it is to believe that the world is run by chaos, that it's all just chance and luck, and that terrible things happen for no reason to good people. Like, if you believe in a cigarette-smoking man, who is basically the devil, and who Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man suggests is behind everything from the fact the Buffalo Bills haven't won the Super Bowl through to the Oscar nominees, who has Saddam Hussein in line too. Like, even if you believe in like a devil like that, if you believe in a man who pulls all those strings, then the world makes sense on some level, which is something that I think is really powerful and really resonates. And I think it's like, the X-Files is rooted in like 90s, in the 90s attitudes and 90s anxieties, but I think that's something very true about the human condition. And like, when I watch it, like, that's like, as a piece of drama, that's what Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man is about to me. It's about how believing the world is like is the result of like the will of a couple of like powerful men doing evil things is more comforting than believing that like the world can be changed by a bullet from a lunatic.
Well said, Darren. Like I said before, you should write a book on the X-Files, man. You have a lot of good insight. You know, also this episode, there's a bit of prequelitis to it. You know, we have the cigarette smoking man's first cigarette, right? Oh, I never smoke, right? But it's nothing quite on the level of like the Star Wars prequels or even Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, so I'll allow it. Did that bother you at all?
It's look, being honest, it's not even as bad as we did Young at Heart, which has which is basically an episode about why Mulder doesn't do things by the book. Like
things that don't require an explanation, right?
Yeah, things that don't require. Like, I like the cigarette as a metaphor for his corrupt. Well, first of all, it's obviously a metaphor for this idea of him not having control of his own destiny, because his mother was a smoker who died of lung cancer. So the idea is that he rejects the cigarettes early on as a way of exerting his own identity, in the same way that he rejects, like, his father was a traitor and a communist, so he becomes like this ultimate patriotic American. But like,
he's compensating, absolutely, yeah.
He's compensating, but he's trying to assert his own identity and his own control over his own destiny. And he can't do that. Like, and that's the thing with the cigarettes and the patch, is the cigarettes keep calling back to him and keep drawing him in. And they're a really good visual metaphor for how, like, he might be responsible for killing Kennedy. He might be responsible for killing, like, Martin Luther King. But this is a guy who can't quit smoking. Like, this is how much free will he has in the world to exert. This is how much influence and power he actually holds. He can't even get his own novel published without the ending being changed. Like, there's this wonderful sense of, like, even if he is this mythic evil figure, he is no more in control of his own life than we are.
Well, that's what's so That's what's so genius about this deconstruction of him as a villain, because he is, if there is a main villain of the X-Files, it's a cigarette smoking man. And so often in fiction, when people try to, let's tell the untold story, right? It's Hannibal, right? Not the TV show, but the or Hannibal Rising, right? Something like that, right? The prequel, right? It's like, what are you doing? Or or the Star Wars prequels, or even a show like Heroes with a character like Sylar, right? That he goes back and forth and good and bad and good and bad. That's dangerous when you have a popular villain and you like, let's use him more. Let's put the spotlight on him more because he's popular. But then you realize, he was popular because he didn't have the spotlight on him. But rare is there a character that can hold up into the kind of attention they pay to the cigarette smoking man. Where like, not only does it not hurt the character, it actually helps him even more because you empathize with them, because it's like, it's so sad to see this powerful guy, this mysterious figure of government who's shadow organizations and it's this ominous presence, but he can't even get his book published, right? He gets so excited when he gets a call from some publisher. It's like, yes. It's just so funny to see his demeanor change in such a way. So it's 3 dimensions to add it to his character.
And even like the little line where it's like, we're really happy to work with young writers, and you're like, this is so sad. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that we were talking about the episodes we're talking about together on the Podwatch here, Darren, because we talked about EBE a while back, and we get to see the scene Deep Throat is talking about in EBE in this episode, or do we? Right?
There is some ambiguity, like because it's Hanoi. He mentions Hanoi in EB, I believe. So it's like Vietnam. I think here,
right. But at the end of that episode, Mulder's like, "Well, which lie do I believe?" And Deep Throat's like, "I don't know. I mean, it was good to be telling the truth. Could not be, So I like to think of it like Deep Throat used the framework of Vietnam, right? Because Mulder can like relate to that and lied about it, and when instead this was the actual event that took place here with the cigarette smoking man. And it's great to see those 2 titans of the X-Files together in a scene, because Deep Throat had been the mythology presence throughout season 1, and then of course his successors like Mr. X kind of took that torch, but even more so like cigarette smoking man took that torch moving forward. And the rest of the show, as Deep Throat went away, cigarette smoking man raised in prominence, and you're like, oh man, these 2 guys, obviously they must have crossed paths, they must have been in the same circle. So it's great to just see just a little brief look at that. And then also, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is really there have been hints maybe towards this, but this is the one episode that's like, yeah, cigarette smoking man is Mulder's dad. Where do you stand on that? Do you like the fact that he's Mulder's dad? Spoilers.
Spoilers for episodes that have already been covered in the Podwatch. But I don't mind it. I think it adds a nice sort of mythic framework to it. I do think that there's points at which, like, I'm not sure about involving, like, Mulder's direct father in the conspiracy, because I think that makes it a little bit too small. But I do like the sort of mythic quality of, like, your dad is Darth Vader of the cigarette smoking man here. And actually, one of the things I like about Musings of the Cigarette Smoking Man is the fact that it goes back a lot to the first season. Like, it goes back to the beginnings of the X-Files, which the 4th season does a lot, because it has, like, you have him reading the Einstein paradox thesis that Scully wrote. You have him, you have footage from the pilot with Scott
Levins.
Yes. Yeah, who will appear for the first time since the first season in Gethsemane at the end of the 4th season.
Yeah, it's almost preparing you for his return. Yeah, remember this guy? He existed. He's coming back. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Like, there's this, the 4th season is very engaged with the first season. Like, there's a lot of, and even like Max Fennig coming back, for example. There's the fact that time travel episode makes another reference to Scully's sort of thesis as well. Like, there's a real sense that, like, the past is something that belongs. And you wrote about, like, the thing about the Cigarette Smoking Man is that he writes fan fiction and publishes it. Like, there's also a sense he's listening to the scene from the pilot where Scully goes down and Mulder's like, no one here but the FBI's most unwanted, and he's smiling, and it's like he's basically a shipper watching X-Files reruns.
So good.
And it's beautiful. It is. It's so good. It's just a perfect episode, and it's fantastic and amazing, and I adore it so much.
All right, Darren. Well, we have to talk about Tunguska because it's our job. So it was written by Frank Spunitz.
I like the sudden shift in tone from, oh my god, that was an amazing episode, to, well, I guess we have to talk about this one now.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, just in a vacuum, it's probably like, yeah, okay, but like compared to that masterpiece we just discussed, we'll get through this one quickly. So written by Frank Spunitz and Chris Carter, directed by Ken Manners, aired on November 24th, 1996. I'm not the biggest fan of this episode. It doesn't sound like you are either. One of the main things I have a problem with it is its structure. It's like one of those like fill in the blank days earlier. Like, I'm not a fan of in media res. I'm just not. And I'm also not a fan of Scully's new hairdo either. So those are some thoughts.
Oh, yeah, top priority there. Structure and Scully's hairdo. Yeah, the structure of this is really, really awful in that, like, the teaser ends with, well, if you don't tell us where Mulder is, you'll be held in contempt of Congress. And then we cut to the opening credits, and you're like, contempt of Congress? Oh, noes! But then you get this, after the credits, you get this sort of flashback sequence, which is actually very effective, which is the bit where the black oil arrives in the sample and sort of, it eats the guard. And that's like, that should be the teaser. Like, we don't need this, as you described, the in media res scene. But the in media res scene is just characters talking about the episode. Like, it's a structure
that really hooks you in, right?
It does. It's like, you're about to see something that's very cool. It's so cool that a bunch of old men in a room are going to talk about how cool it is. Nothing sells it quite like that. But it's such a terrible structure. And, like, in some cases you would argue that it's like a framing device. There are cases, I think, I'm trying to think, there's an episode of The X-Files where it ran short. So, it's not. It's Space Above and Beyond, which is written by Morgan and Wong, where the episode ran short, so they added a framing device of the flashbacks to it. But, like, Tunguska and Terma is a two-parter. There's no way that it ran so short that they went back and added Fritz Weaver and this big congressional subplot. It's just like somebody at some point in the process thought this was the best way to open this episode, and you're like, no, it wasn't. Tunguska and Terma are the first mythology episodes I remember not being impressed by. Because I know there's been bad mythology individual episodes before. Like, for example, I point out The Blessing Way as one of the worst episodes of the third season. But even stuff like Herrenvolk at the start of the fourth season is not a great episode. But I think that, like, the surrounding episodes and the stories being told, so obviously like Paperclip and Anasazi, or even like Talitha Kumi, they're fantastic episodes of themselves. Tunguska and Terma is the first time I watched a mythology two-parter and thought that was underwhelming.
Lucky for me, I'll be back to talk about Terma as well. So
Fantastic! I feel like I'm just filling you with enthusiasm and hope there and excitement.
Well, the good news is, and we're getting ahead of ourselves, but not only am I talking about Terma, I'm talking about Paper Hearts. So it's another situation like this. One of my all-time favorite episodes of the entire series, and this awkward two-parter, second half of this thing. But anyway, so that's. I'm sorry, guys. If you're a fan of Terma, hey, let us know. We're sorry if we shortchanged you, but Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man really casts a long shadow that Terma could not, or Tunguska, whichever, could not get out of.
I'll say, okay, I feel like you put me on the spot and made me want to say something nice about Tunguska. One of the things I like about Tunguska is that it plays into this idea, and it happens a lot in the fourth season, where Carter's flirting with skepticism about paranoia and conspiracy. And I think that's in a direct response to stuff like the Oklahoma City bombing. Like, Tunguska and Terma is the first time that you see the show deal with this idea that conspiracy theory and paranoia is not a good thing, where you have Krychek joining the militia, and you have, like, Mulder talking about how we could be looking at the next Oklahoma City, and you have this sense that, like, paranoia and government mistrust can lead to bad things like the terrorist attacks that happened in the 90s. I think that's very clever. I think that sets up ideas that will pay off later in the season, like Unrequited, for example, also touches on the militia, but also stuff like Gethsemane, which leads into Mulder's sort of skeptical arc. You have this idea that Carter is becoming more questioning of paranoia and more questioning of fear and conspiracy, and that's the one thing that I like about Tunguska. I also like that when Krychek is arrested, he's like, the truth, there's no truth. These men, they make it up as they go along. They're the engineers of the future. And you're like, is Krychek talking about the writers who are plotting the mythology at this point?
How meta, yes. Yeah. All right. Well, see, guys, look, we pulled up from the nosedive. If you're a fan of Tunguska, there we go. There's some positivity for you. All right, Darren, well, it's been fun talking about these two episodes. Well, one of the two episodes. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I'm going to be nice now to Tunguska. We had fun talking about it, too.
Careful, or I'll drop you off at Skinner's apartment.
Oh, no. Just don't put me on the balcony. But if people want to find you, Darren, on the internet, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Darren_Mooney. I co-host The 250, which is a movie podcast looking at the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. It's available on the Black Hole Media Podbean and also on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever good podcasts are available. I've also written a book, which I think maybe I've mentioned like 50,000 times on these podcasts, but I'll never get tired of saying it. It's Opening the X-Files. It's available on Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, wherever good books are sold. If you are interested in the X-Files, I personally... completely objectively think it's a great read, but I've had some other people say some very nice things about it as well, so please consider having a look at it.
Awesome, will do. As for me personally, you can find me on Twitter at MoronZach. That's MOOREONZACH. I'm also the host of my own podcast, Always Hold On to Smallville, where we talk about each and every episode of that Young Superman show. We're on Twitter at Always Smallville with one S. And I'm also the host of Standard Orbit on the Trek FM network. We talk about the old and new adventures of Captain Kirk and the Enterprise over there. You can find us on Twitter at Trek FM. As for the Xcast, you can find us on Twitter at the X_cast and our Facebook page and fan group, the Xcast X-Files Podcast Fan Group. If you just search the Xcast on Facebook, you will find us there. Well, the Podwatch will be back tomorrow, as will I, covering Terma and Paper Hearts. But until then, trust no one.